My phone alarm going off every single time. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the next day of TMF Week 2025. We're very excited for today's session. I'm Danny Gould. I am your host this morning. With me is Joanne Malia. So I'm just going to get some housekeeping done first. Let me just make sure. Can everyone hear me? Can you see the presentation? Let me know where you're chiming in from in the chat before I get started. Let's see. Is everything, can people see me? I see that people are flooding into the chat a little bit. Oh, perfect. Yeah, I'm seeing that. I have the public tab open, not the session one. Perfect. Thank you, Caitlin. Thank you, Sam. Good to see everybody. I see some familiar names in the chat. Good to see everybody. So yeah, we have an exciting session for you guys today. So just to go over the housekeeping like we usually do. So all the sessions are going to be recorded and available at the end of the conference. All attendees are going to receive a certificate of attendance for the entirety of TMF week, not just today's session. And so we're going to give those out at the end of the week. Questions are going to be answered at the end of the presentation. You can ask your questions in the QA tab on the right there next to the Docs tab. And if you want to download the slides and follow along, you can find those in the Docs tab right there. And then afterward, we are going to have a networking break so that you guys can all mingle and talk about the exciting session we have for you this morning. So we're going to do it the usual standard session. It's going to be a 30-minute presentation. We're going to have 15 minutes for QA, and then I'm going to introduce the next session, and then I'll put you guys in your breakout rooms. So I turn it over to Joanne Malia. Joanne, I'm very excited for this. This title's fantastic, first of all. So I'm very excited for the presentation. Tell us about it.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I hope everyone can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you fine. So
okay,
I hope
perfect, perfect. So this is a little bit about me. I do head up the Regeneron Pharmaceuticals Development Records Management Group and have been associated with the TMF for many years. I currently sit on the steering committee, and you can read everything else. This is my normal disclaimer. These are my thoughts. And so let's hop right into it. Earlier this year, ICH E6 R3 was released in January. And for all of you who may not be aware, ICH is a harmonization organization. It consists of 23 members and 38 observers. So quite a number of interests and participation in generating this guideline. As a historical perspective, E6 has been around for a while. The first version actually came out in May of 1996. And then shortly thereafter, they realized that there had been a few mistakes made. So R1 was released in June of 96. R2 came in 2016. And I think at that point, they realized that some of the concepts and the terminology maybe was not really staying current. You know, our industry does tend to advance rather quickly. So they were looking for a new version that would sort of be future-proof. It would at least prescribe principles that could be used in the future, even though the actual scenario or situation may not have been considered, previously. The document itself is really for interventional clinical trials of investigational products that are intended to be submitted to regulatory authorities. However, the organization realizes that these principles are pretty broad and pretty general, and they should be considered for all clinical trials. So it's not something that should just be limited, but considered as you do your work with different types of studies. Now, just to give you an idea of what this document actually looks like and how it's structured, because it has changed. There is a section at the beginning that really does describe the principles of ICH GCP. Everyone should definitely take a look at that. It's very instructive and lays out, what you need to consider and to follow for GCPs. Then there are the annexes, and currently Annex 1 is included in R3. This is for interventional clinical trials. Our Annex 2 is currently being reviewed, and last I heard, they were hoping to have that released by the end of the year. We'll see, if that actually does happen. There are a number of appendices that support the entire document. So this structure is really new. The previous one was a little different. The principles really make up the core of the document. And regardless of, the type of study that you're doing, or even if it is not for a regulatory submission, you should probably look at these principles and really try to fulfill them somehow with your clinical trial. The document is, as I said, organized into a number of different categories or sections. The first one, of course, is your typical introduction. Then you have your principles. So this is a, up to 10-page section of the document that I encourage you all to really take a look at and take to heart. Annex 1 does have a number of sections, as did R2. They focused on the IRB or ethics committees. There's a section for the investigator, for the sponsor, and a new section focusing on data governance. This data governance section is for both investigators and sponsors, as investigators are beginning to have more and more systems. The next section are the appendices that I had mentioned before. There's one on the investigator brochure. There's one on the protocol and protocol amendments. And then what's near and dear to all of our hearts are the essential records that make up Appendix C. And then you'll see Annex 2 will be coming hopefully sometime this year or early next year. So if you recall, there are principles in R2 and in R3. These have been consolidated. So there are only 11 principles now, but there are subsections to many of these principles. There are two new ones. One is on risk proportionality, and the other one is on roles and responsibilities. These were not called out specifically. In R2, there were a number of mentions of taking risk-based approaches. Now they have really made this a firm section of the guidance, and there's a lot of really good information under risk proportionality and roles and responsibilities that you should really consider as you're setting up your study. Okay, so there are some differences, and probably the biggest one for us is with the terminology. Everybody knows what documents are, and now we have to get used to the term records. I think this is a more general term. It also includes data. It includes other things that may not be considered a document, maybe a video, maybe biological samples. A lot of different things could be a record. So I think this is a more general term, and it's something that we now need to get used to. The other term that probably impacts us greatly is with our CROs and vendors. These are now called service providers. They're not differentiated between CROs and vendors. So our new term is service providers. So if you're like me, I'm still getting used to it and I sometimes fall back, but it is something that we need to, sort of get used to as we move forward. And then finally, I know there's a lot of people out there that are very interested and very happy that we have moved from subjects to participants. So it's important to really look at that and be careful how you use the term, and just be consistent with ICH R3. Another area where they made some changes was the glossary. And there are some definitions that have been enhanced and added. So one of the examples that I have here is just with audit trail, just to show you what it said in R2 and what it says in R3 now. It's a little bit more prescriptive as to what we really need to include in that audit trail. So I would, caution you to take a look at the glossary, see what has actually changed, because it could impact how you're reading the actual document itself. Also, ICH has basically said that they really did try to future-proof this guideline. They wanted to make sure that it could be used in the future, and really have some principles or some good guidelines or concepts in the document that could be used as technology changes, as we have different ways of doing things, and in some cases when some regulations may change slightly. The other thing that I really want to caution you on, I know in the past everyone looked at Section 8, I believe it was, in R2, and that would define all of the documents that needed to be maintained for a clinical study. Now you have to be a little bit more careful. Record requirements are throughout the whole document. So you need to check the IRB and ethics section, the investigator section, and the sponsor section, because there are record requirements sprinkled throughout the document. There is a lot of information in Appendix C that really does define exactly what is typically expected for a study, but there are some other requirements in other sections. Okay, just some key concepts and things to consider as you are, reading the document. A lot of this document incorporates quality by design principles, and this really builds on ICH E6 R1, and this is another guideline that is a companion document to the E6. So they should be read together so that you have a better idea of really how clinical trials and studies are to be managed. Risk proportionality is definitely something that comes out throughout this document. And if there's one thing that you need to remember from this presentation is risk proportionality. It does allow you some flexibility on how you actually do some things. It does not talk about taking risks. What it does do is help you identify those risky areas and mitigating those. So think of it as a preventive approach to handling some of the things that we know happen with every clinical study, so that we're prepared and more proactive than reactive. Another thing that they do say is that all studies are not equal. The protocol really defines what needs to be collected and managed throughout the clinical study or clinical trial. So you need to really focus on the protocol and compliance to that protocol. For example, a phase 1 study may not have the same requirements as a phase 3 or phase 4. They may be totally different. There may be different documents or records that are collected from both, and that should be at least defined in the protocol. Additionally, the sponsor should not place an unnecessary burden on sites and participants. This comes through over and over again, and really sponsors should try to make sure that the study is easy for people to fulfill their part. So whether that be participants or sites, that should be kept in the forefront as the protocol is being defined. And additionally, the regulatory agencies are really pushing critical thinking and decision-making back to sponsors or to sites as appropriate. So they really do expect you to justify some of the decisions that you make and make sure that those are documented appropriately. Okay, there are a few things with essential documents. They do have a number of things in the appendix that talks about the essentiality of trial records. And this should be assessed, but the assessment is not required to be documented. Additionally, it does say what an essential record is, and these are usually trial-specific procedures or plans, anything that shows that you are complying with the protocol or any procedures within the study. And they actually have 28 criteria for determining if a record needs to be part of the TMF or its associated repositories. Let's see. One other thing that has come up that regulators have pointed to is not everything necessarily goes into the TMF. There may be other repositories that support the study. For example, I know in my area, we often have our contracts. They have it in a separate system. Some of our data is located in a separate system. Those repositories need to be considered if they are to be part of what I call the virtual TMF. Additionally, there are requirements, again, defined by the protocol that need to be considered as you go through your study and determine what type of documents, records need to be in your TMF. And just so that you are aware, there were 7,000 comments to ICH R3 in the last go round. So I think a lot of people have a lot of interest in this guideline, and the regulators were very careful in how they looked at all of these comments and incorporated the ones that they needed to. Here are some of the changes. I won't go in through all of these, but you will have them in the slides, so you can take a look at them later. For investigators, they need to keep sponsors informed as to the person who is responsible for records at their site throughout the retention period. This is actually a good thing, so that they know who to contact if there's a question or concern. Sponsors really need to make sure that they keep a record of where the essential records are located, including any source records. So it's, I'm sure many of you may have an index or an inventory list that you use. This should really just be sort of built out at the end of your study and really define where those records might be located. Let's see. The other thing I think everybody knows about safeguarding the blind. This has been there for a while. Additionally, there has been a requirement that sponsors inform investigators and service providers when the record retention period is up. Now, this is something that's been in GCPs for a while, but I think now under R3, it's clear that the sponsor is responsible for notifying all other parties when that retention period is over. And let's see, you need to also consider documents that are part of the story, but not necessarily at a study level. So these are things maybe like the IB, or maybe the system validation of your TMF. So any documents that really support some of the systems, maybe procedures, really need to be considered so that these are always available through the retention period. Now, there is a table in ICH E6 R3 that has 54 record types that should be considered as essential records. These are not all inclusive. There may be others. They do have those 28 various categories of documents that, or 28 categories of types of documents that need to be considered. These two go hand in hand. What I've done here is called out some of the differences or things that you may not have been aware of previously. So these are either new documents or additional documents in, records that are part of your clinical study. So this is just to give you an idea of some new expectations. Okay. Now, as I said, there is a new section in E6 that talks about data governance. It's quite long, but it's really important to take a look at this, and it's important for those who actually have an electronic TMF. There are things that you really should consider to make sure that you have the full data life cycle considered as part of your records and documentation. And these should really focus on the criticality of the data. So it's really important to consider, like the clinical data more critically than maybe a little database of, I don't know, maybe email addresses or something along that line. So you really need to take a look at the data and the purpose of that information. So as part of this governance, what they are really telling you is what processes are important to be considered under this data governance section. Of course, anything that deals with confidentiality of participants. So that's always important to really consider from start to finish. Making sure that our systems are fit for purpose and used appropriately. Any procedures that are really to safeguard, essential elements of clinical trials, such as randomization, dose escalation, blinding. I would also probably add such things as deviations, things that could really impact the results or patient safety. And also to really have a process to support key decision-making. So those things that are important to the study, as they mention here, those you should have good procedures to support those and make sure that those are well-defined and available. Okay. And in addition, make sure that any acquired data is actually accompanied by relevant metadata. So as you're bringing data from either your sites, or if you acquire some data, make sure that you have the appropriate metadata so that you are able to trace back where that actually came from. Now with audit trails, they have really added a number of different things that need to be considered. Obviously, audit trails should not be disabled. However, they do specify in certain rare circumstances where you may need to modify the audit trail. For example, if personal information is released. You also need to make sure that you have a review of the audit trail, and they specify now what you should be looking for and considering as part of this. Also, of course, I think we all know that account creation and maintenance is really important, because we need to know who had access to our system and who is doing what in our systems. So this all needs to be considered as part of, the audit trail, making sure that it's legible and understandable. So a number of these things they've really called out to actually help us, but also to help with the data integrity of our studies, and so they can really feel confident and trust the information that we send in. So in summary, I just want to wrap up and basically say, if there's nothing else that you remember from this presentation, remember risk proportionality. And I encourage you all to take a look at ICH E6 R3, because there's a lot of really good information in there. It does require a careful read. I would also suggest that you not read it just once, but go back periodically and take a look at it, because I know for myself, sometimes situations actually help define another look and a different way of looking at the guidelines themselves. So with that, I will end, and I guess we're ready for any questions.
Yes. Amazing. Thank you, Joanne. That was fantastic. I found it so interesting. I mean, as someone who, is learning all the regulation, I had no idea that like R1 and R2 went back so far, I always figured it was something that was like an early 2000s sort of thing back in the 90s. So that's really interesting. So we had some questions that came in, so I'm going to put them on the screen for you.
Okay.
So we got the first one from Usman Ashraf. So given the risk-based and quality by design focus in ICH E6 R3, how should TMF strategies evolve to proactively support these principles throughout the trial lifecycle?
That's a great question. I think this can't be done in isolation. It does need various people across the spectrum of a clinical study. It does start with the protocol, as they basically mention in the guideline. And I think it also comes to the risk assessment that is done at the beginning of the study to really help, define what possible risks there may be, and really thinking, how can we mitigate that? I usually look at it at two different levels. There's a risk assessment often done for the clinical study itself. And typically, the TMF doesn't usually get included in that because it's really geared more for the patient and the data itself. However, there is an opportunity now to really look a little deeper and to say, okay, can we do a risk assessment on the TMF to make sure that we could support a regulatory submission and an inspection that might follow right after. So that needs to be considered, and maybe a separate assessment actually done. Now, just to put a plug in for the risk initiative from the reference model group, we just recently published a white paper and a tool for risk assessment of the TMF. So I encourage you to take a look at that and see how you might want to use that in your day-to-day. It was compared against R3, so a number of things from R3 were included in that. So I hope that helps.
Cool. Yeah, and we have plenty of other. Oh, here we go. So where can I find these 28 categories? Are they included in R3? So this was early in the presentation when this question came in. Yeah.
Yep. Yes, they are there. It really does talk to the essentiality of the documents, and then it lists the criteria for how to consider those documents. So it's all right there.
And then here's another one. We got, what's the best approach for a TMF audit trail review? What do we need to focus on during this review?
Great question. I think we're still figuring this one out as an industry. I think the original intent was to make sure that no one is in your system that shouldn't be there, and that those people who are in the system are doing what they're supposed to. That's a little difficult to determine at some level. There are some times where we've used an audit trail review to actually determine if there was a unblinded document that was put in to the TMF inadvertently as an unblinded document. So that people could read it who weren't supposed to. We've had to go back and figure out. So did anyone from the study team actually look at that who shouldn't have? So that type of review probably needs to be included, but it's not one, hopefully, that you need to do on a regular basis, or just to confirm that you don't have any situations there that are causing you concern.
Perfect. So yeah, we got some great questions coming in, actually. What's it? Here we go. In light of the E6 R3 emphasis on critical data and processes, how can the TMF professionals better identify and manage essential documents tied to risk areas?
This needs to be done with the study team. Again, with that risk assessment that the study team is hopefully doing at the study level. There should be things that, if you take a look at that, you can say, okay, for example, the primary efficacy variable is this. It's maybe data that's coming from an ECOA vendor. So we're really going to want to make sure that the process around that data is solid, and that the documentation that is supporting that data is complete, and that it comes in as it needs to come in, whether that be periodically or at the end of the study. So it really needs to be done hand in hand with that risk assessment, along with the protocol, so that you have a good idea of what's really important to that specific study.
And then we have another one from Katie Hoover. Should we apply ICH E3 or E6 R3 requirements to currently active and closing studies in TMFs? If so, what would you suggest as the best approach?
That's a good question. I would say if you have a study, well, first of all, the guideline is going into effect next month, but it does depend on the country that you are doing the work in. Each country has sort of a different process of how they are rolling out this guideline. So make sure that you understand what that timeline is and what I would say, the lock of your TMF actually is. So I would not go back to a study that is going to lock prior to July to say, oh, let's clean this up and make it R3 compliant. Because I think that's not expected. But anything moving forward should be compliant to R3. If there are things that maybe you have a study, you are locking it in a month or two, and you know that it's a pivotal study and is going to most likely be inspected by some regulators, you may want to go back and say, okay, what's the gap? What things don't we have in that TMF, so that we could at least identify where those records may be. What I'm thinking of would be specifically like computer system validation documentation, that maybe, you have it, but you just didn't put it someplace where you could easily get a hold of it. So you may just want to beef up your list of documents and repositories, just so that you're ready for that inspection, even though most of the study was actually done under R2. So it's something that you probably should work with your quality assurance group and really come up with maybe a storyboard or some other documentation to explain the situation.
No, and it's actually really interesting you mentioned the CSA validation like that, because I've noticed, especially since I work with Part 11 a lot, I've noticed that the FDA is really kind of scrutinizing that a lot more than they did during the post-COVID era. So I've actually been seeing in practice exactly what you just said. So that's encouraging to kind of see that reinforced.
Yeah.
So we got another good one from Michaela. So as pointed out on slide 25, repositories beyond the TMF need to be considered. I would be interested to understand how you are currently handling those satellite documents, and do you consider any integrations of systems, i.e. A regulatory system, a RIM software with an eTMF, and what's your experience with cross-linking and copying documents?
Yeah, when it comes to like RIM and the TMF, if we have it in one, we cross-link to the other so that they have it there. So we're not like taking it out of one and putting it into the other. We're just making sure that people can view it from one to the other. The other repositories that often come to mind are the contracts system. Now, no one, I don't think, in the industry is going to allow an inspector into their contract system. But there has to be a mechanism by which they get the contracts that they actually need for that inspection. So while it may not say you can have access to it, it would be, the contracts will be provided, upon request of a certain individual. Additionally, there are some that I've actually seen in my career where they wanted to look at the data. So in those circumstances, we had to let them see our SAS server. However, it is not something that we allowed them just to go in and play around in. We were the hands, and they sat there, and we drove. However, a lot of the considerations for systems need to be considered before an inspection so that you know where your boundaries are and what you can allow the inspector to do. You have to give them access to the systems. That's part of the regulations in Europe. So you just have to be prepared as to how you will give them that access. And if you can't, because you may have very good reasons, like your contract system, you have to be able to give them those records somehow. So.
Absolutely. Well, Joanne, with that, I see that we're coming up on time, so we have so many more questions that we could answer, but unfortunately, we don't have enough time to answer them. So first of all, guys, thank you for your participation. Some of these questions have been so interesting. I know that I've also learned a lot from Joanne's presentation, but I'm going to go ahead and introduce the next session. So we have coming up with Jana de Rubertis and Mike Zwenko here from Montreal. We got trust issues, safeguarding data integrity in the modern TMF ecosystem. So in about a minute, you guys are going to be put into your breakout rooms where you can mingle and chat and enjoy the 15-minute break between sessions. And then after that, we will see you all for another session today with Jana and Mike. Joanne, thank you once again. That was such a wonderful presentation. I think, just judging by the reactions in the chat and all the questions we got, I could tell that there was a lot of knowledge that was kind of transferred to the crowd. So I'm happy to have you here, and thank you so much for speaking at TMF Week.
Thank you.
Yeah. All righty, guys. Well, without further ado, I'll let you guys get into your breakout rooms. Thank you so much. Thank you for all attending, and we're looking forward to another great day here at TMF Week. Talk to you all soon.